Je ne me remettrai jamais de cette émotion. C'était incroyable.
Bien, d'abord, bonsoir. Nous avons fait les autres salles d'abord, parce que Steven a voulu absolument saluer les deux autres salles, qui sont pleines aussi, qui malheureusement ne le verront pas directement. Eh bien, il y a à peu près 3 ans, avec Serge Touliana, nous étions à Los Angeles, et l'idée nous est venue, je crois, je ne sais pas si c'était la vôtre, plutôt, nous avons compris le manque qu'il y avait à la Cinémathèque, c'est-à-dire que le plus grand metteur en scène du monde n'était pas présenté à la Cinémathèque française. Alors, je l'ai appelé et immédiatement, il a réagi positivement, il a dit oui, je viens. Il a fallu attendre un peu parce qu'il faisait des films. Alors Steven, je vais vous dire 2 choses. Nous considérons, ici à la Cinémathèque, nous sommes très heureux que vous soyez là, le public l'a montré aussi, que vous êtes disons, le plus important metteur en scène du monde, le plus populaire. C'est lui qui a une œuvre très variée et d'une grande qualité à chaque film. Je pense même que, à part Charlie Chaplin, je ne vois pas quel autre metteur en scène a cette grande popularité. Parce que vous avez réussi à avoir en même temps des grands films et aussi avoir une relation très directe et permanente avec le public et avec tous vos films. Alors là, la question qui me vient à l'esprit est la suivante. Quel est votre secret? Il est vrai que Cocteau disait qu'il y a des règles pour faire un succès, mais nous ne les connaissons pas. Et j'ai l'impression que vous les connaissez. Alors, si vous les connaissez, dites-le. Nous sommes à la Cinémathèque, je vous promets que ça ne sortira pas d'ici.
Si j'avais un secret, et si quelqu'un connaît le secret, je serais bien content qu'il me le dise à moi, parce que moi non plus, j'ai pas la moindre idée. Je ne sais absolument pas. Vous savez, tout d'abord, c'est un immense honneur, un immense privilège de me retrouver de retour ici à Paris, surtout devant un public aussi jeune, de cinéphiles, de cinéastes, de gens qui adorent le cinéma. Et je veux dire que moi, j'ai commencé à faire du cinéma quand j'étais gamin, parce que je ne voyais rien de plus amusant à faire que cela. J'étais qu'un gamin de 12-13 ans, il n'y avait rien d'autre à faire, en tout cas sur Terre, qui puisse m'intéresser autant que de prendre une caméra de 8 mm et puis raconter une histoire en 3 ou 4 minutes. Et moi, je me dis que s'il y a un secret, de quelque manière que ce soit, une explication de ma passion depuis toutes ces années, c'est que lorsque je fais un film aujourd'hui, eh bien, j'ai la même sensation, la même énergie nerveuse, la même excitation. Et je me ressentais exactement la même chose à 12-13 ans. Et maintenant, je viens d'avoir 65 ans, j'éprouve la même émotion. Et ceci n'est pas parti. Peut-être que lorsque l'émotion partira, peut-être, mais sinon...
Serge, sur le film de ce soir, on avait décidé de commencer par vous interroger sur War Horse, le film que le public nous demande de découvrir. Et pouvez-vous nous dire, Steven Spielberg, pourquoi vous avez eu envie d'adapter ce roman et cette pièce de théâtre pour en faire un film? Qu'est-ce qui vous motivait dans l'histoire de Joe et ce cheval?
Vous savez, lorsque j'ai lu le livre de Michael Morpurgo, c'est écrit en 1982, j'étais très étonné que personne n'ait fait quoi que ce soit avec. J'ai vu l'adaptation dramatique au théâtre et j'étais très étonné de voir que personne n'en avait fait un film. Pourquoi? Parce que le récit seul, est déjà en soi, c'est déjà un film. Quand vous lisez le livre, lorsque vous voyez la pièce, vous avez déjà un film sous les yeux. Et j'étais tout à fait stupéfait que personne n'avait eu l'idée de prendre ici
a boy who raises a horse and is devoted to the horse, and then the horse saves the farm, and then the horse is sent to France to fight on the Somme in World War I, and and the boy suddenly joins the army to go searching for his horse. It was something very clear. I love stories that are completely clear, that aren't encumbered by excessive, I guess you could call it symbolism or metaphor. And there's nothing symbolic about that. We can find symbolism and metaphor in everything, But for me, it was a very, very emotional, story straight to my heart. I cried when I saw it on stage, and yet I made the movie for different reasons, not because I wanted people to cry, but because I wanted to show that in the middle of a war, especially that war, which was fought mostly in this country, that the differences between people could be momentarily resolved in a mutual admiration and love for an animal. That it took an animal to bring two sides together, even if only for 4 minutes, and that was the nucleus of that story that got me to make it into a movie.
Vous avez dans ce film une chose très inhabituelle. D'abord, vous avez un animal, on déteste avoir des animaux dans un film, c'est la chose la plus difficile, ça coûte cher. Eh bien, vous avez un animal, un cheval, qui est un acteur. Alors la question que je voudrais vous poser, est-ce que c'est un cheval savant que vous avez rencontré quelque part, ou c'est un cheval que vous avez complètement éduqué? Vous avez fait éduquer naturellement, exactement, on lui a fait apprendre ce rôle et qu'il le joue dans les films parce qu'il est absolument étonnant.
Well, the horse was extraordinary. There was more than one horse that performed the role of Joey. There was one horse that did all the running without a rider. There was another horse that did jumping. But principally, there were two horses that did all the acting, a horse named Finder and a horse named Abraham. And I didn't directly communicate with the horses because they would just look at me and not respond. They would just stare at me, and maybe the ears would turn listening to my voice, and the ears would go back with disinterest. So I hired a horse whisperer. You've all heard of horse whisperers. And his name was Bobby Lovegren. And I produced a movie, my company produced a movie called Seabiscuit a number of years ago, and Bobby trained Seabiscuit. And so Kathy Kennedy, my producer, thought we should bring Bobby on to train Joey. And Bobby was the mastermind of communication between the script and the needs of the script, my needs as the director, and the horse that needed to be responsive to his role. And Bobby and his very skilled assistants trained and got the horses to do what we needed them to do. It was amazing watching Bobby. That's a whole other story. Just watching Bobby work these horses without a single whip, without any coaxing with food. He just has a way with horses, they listen to him. He should have a co-director credit on this.
It's amazing watching the horse.
The horse was a beautiful animal. We lived with 10 horses. My 15-year-old daughter is a competitive show jumper. My wife rides dressage. So I, for maybe 12, 14 years, had horses on the property. And I always, I was always amazed that people give dogs so much credit for being, emotive. And when in fact horses are more subtle than dogs, but they are no less compassionate.
Et le début du film, ça ressemble à un film américain classique, je dirais. Un peu, j'ai pensé à John Ford, la terre, le ciel, cette petite famille de paysans qui ont beaucoup de difficultés. Est-ce que pour vous, c'est une référence de commencer un film par ce qui fonde au fond le cinéma classique américain, cette idée que sur ce petit lopin de terre, il va se passer l'histoire, et une histoire qui est fondée sur l'éducation, l'épreuve.
Well, certainly that was in the book. The farm, the poor family scratching out a living in very, rock, granite hard earth, and that was part of the play. That was certainly a component that was invented by Michael Morpurgo when he wrote his book. So I didn't come up with that, that idea, but it is an idea that John Ford used to love to make movies about. How Green Was My Valley, The Quiet Man, The Grapes of Wrath, Tobacco Road. I mean, these were all films where the land was a significant character, played a big part in the telling of the story. And certainly, with all that raw material, it brought me back to John Ford as well. And I just simply did what I think any sensible director would have done if they were in my position shooting the same script. That is, don't shoot close-up, shoot wide shots. And the wider I could bring my camera, the farther back I could go, the landscape suddenly became a pivotal character, because since the family is going to survive or perish based on the land, and so many young boys did perish in no man's land on the Somme between 1914 and 1918, the land had to be relevant.
Et à la fin, Albert revient chez sa mère, comme dans les grands films classiques aussi. il revient au foyer. Et entre-temps, il a vécu la guerre, il s'est émancipé, il s'est éduqué. On a le sentiment que ce film, War Horse, c'est un grand, comme dans les grands romans du 19e siècle, c'est un grand film sur l'éducation, sur l'épreuve de l'histoire et de la guerre.
That's very true, and we're all talking now about the basic ingredients that attracted me to the story in the first place. Those were the family values, you know, the salt of the earth values that made this film, you know, something that I couldn't resist. As a matter of fact, I became so impassioned after seeing the play shortly after reading the book that I launched this film in 7 months, which is, as you know, that's a very, very short amount of time to start shooting a movie. From the time we started working on the script to the time I called action for the first time in Devon, in England, was 7 months. That and E.T. sort of share a record. E.T. took 7 months from the time the script was written to the time we did the first shot, and War Horse took 7 months.
Ce qui m'a très agréablement surpris, c'est la première partie du film. Je vais rebondir à ce que disait Serge. C'est que vous prenez tout le temps pour expliquer la vie de ces gens. Et vous me donnez l'impression que vous avez vraiment une connaissance d'agriculteur. La façon de voir la terre, de voir comment il est difficile de creuser la terre et de cultiver la terre d'une manière formidable. Et le problème que ça pose, c'est quand même formidable. C'est presque un documentaire. Étiez-vous, moi je connais un peu votre biographie, vous n'êtes pas un homme de terre.
Look at these hands, not a single callus. Look at this. These are hands that haven't even touched sink water. So I have to say, I have to admit that no, I'm the communicator between the book, the script, and to you. I didn't have to get my hands dirty, but I did fall into a hole during the shooting of the movie. That was one of the most hazard thing that happened to me. I fell into a hole in one of the trenches when it rained the night before and filled the trenches up with water. And nobody told me the special effects guys put a big hole in the ground and plant an explosive device, and the rain had washed away the orange cones to tell you don't step in the hole, and I went right into the hole. So perhaps that was paying some dues.
Monsieur Spielberg, filmer la Première Guerre mondiale, pour vous, c'est la première fois. Et qu'est-ce que vous avez appris sur cette guerre? Qu'est-ce qu'elle avait de spécifique par rapport à la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, en termes de mise en scène, en termes de cinéma?
Well, I think
Vous savez,
we did a lot of research with the Imperial War Museum in London, and I saw so many amazing photographs. At that moment, that was the most photographed and documented war in history, and of course, it was the first time that movie film was exposed on a war. The first time 35mm film was exposed on an actual war. Before that, Civil War started with Matt and Brady and all of the still photographs. But this war was a paradigm changer. The camera was part of the experience, and the airplane was invented and immediately used as an instrument of terror and death. The tank was invented and instantly used as an implement of terror and death. And then chemical warfare was invented. And it was an experimental war that actually presaged the entire future, which was absolutely frightening. And so there were so many things that I could suggest, but I couldn't actually specify because there was a bigger human interest story occurring that made the war the backdrop, but did not make the Great War the principal focus of War Horse.
Je disais, quand on discutait avant avec Steven, je lui disais le plan de la première attaque, quand ils sortent des tranchées et ils attaquent, c'est un plan absolument extraordinaire. Je ne crois pas l'avoir vu une autre fois au cinéma. Est-ce que vous avez un storyboard quand vous faites naturellement ce film? Parce que c'est une énorme production. On se demande vraiment, on ne peut pas improviser ces choses-là. On ne peut pas arriver sur le plateau et dire voilà, on fait ça, et ça, etc.
No, I had to have many storyboards on this film because I had to show the horse trainers what I was expecting the horses to do. So I not only storyboarded the entire movie, but I actually did previs animated previs on some of the bigger sequences, like the over-the-top, the men coming out of the trenches, and like Joey's run, his mad panic dash to no man's land when he runs alone at night. That was all not only storyboarded, previs, so the trainers could look at the images that I was creating and saying, that's impossible, that's too dangerous, I wouldn't subject the horse to that. And many times I imagined something that couldn't be shot because it was too dangerous for the horses. And I didn't want to use digital horses because I didn't want this movie to be, because you're also smart, you've seen so many digital movies, everybody in this room instantly can tell real from synthetic. Even though we all intended to look real, you know that it's not authentic. And if you like the story, you'll buy into the inauthenticity because you don't want to spoil the experience for yourself. But I didn't want Warhorse to be a digital movie, so a lot of my shots I just couldn't do because they were impossible.
Ce qui m'a impressionné beaucoup dans War Horse, c'est la double approche. C'est à la fois un film sur la guerre et c'est un conte. Et j'ai le sentiment que là, vous vous y retrouvez complètement en tant que cinéaste, parce que vous avez toujours filmé la guerre, mais ce qui prime chez vous, c'est le récit, c'est raconter une histoire. Et là, le conte est formidablement prenant, parce que c'est un conte sur l'enfance, sur l'éducation, sur la formation. Mais est-ce que ça vous dit quelque chose, ce duo, filmer la guerre, faire un conte pour les enfants, le public?
It is, which is why I think this really could be looked upon as a family film. I would say like an older family film, because I certainly wouldn't want 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old kids perhaps seeing Warhorse by themselves, even with family members, because it's somewhat very intense. But it is a family film, and that's why I didn't take the same approach I took with Private Ryan or my TV series Band of Brothers or The Pacific. I wasn't here to put the actuality of what the veterans of that war experienced. I was here to tell a classic, romantic, if you pardon the expression, story about a love for an animal and what this boy will do to recover his animal, and also how this horse touches everyone's life on both sides of the trenches.
Quelles ont été les plus grandes difficultés sur ce film pour vous? Sont des difficultés liées à quoi? Liées au fait de diriger un cheval? Quelles étaient pour vous les choses les plus difficiles, qui vous ont appris quelque chose sur votre métier, peut-être?
What I learned really
Vous avez
was
déjà appris
patience,
quelque
because
chose,
when
c'était
you're
la
working with
patience,
animals,
l'art
none
de la
of the
patience,
patience, you
parce que
should
quand
not
on
be
travaille
working
avec
with
des animaux,
animals.
si on n'a pas de patience, il ne faut pas travailler
Children
avec des
also.
animaux. Pareil avec les enfants d'ailleurs.
Having experienced that
Beaucoup de
with
patience, j'en ai
E.T.,
fait l'expérience avec
you
E.T.
have to have infinite
Il faut
patience,
avoir
but if
beaucoup
you
de
have
patience, mais
patience,
si on a
and
cette
you just
patience
wait,
et l'on attend,
they bring it to you.
alors
And
vous êtes
certainly I
largement
had
payé en
patience with all
retour.
my kids on
Moi,
E.T.
j'ai
and Drew
essayé de
Barrymore,
montrer,
her
faire preuve de
improvisations,
patience
her
avec Drew
moments of
Barrymore,
real life
ces moments
within
vraiment
cinema,
sévères à
which
l'écran,
brought
c'était
that movie
très
to
grand
life
moment de
for
cinéma,
me,
c'est cela
were
qui, pour
amazing.
moi, a
And
rendu
that's
le film
because we
réel
waited.
en quelque
We
sorte,
just
mais parce
waited for
qu'on
Drew to have an
a pris
idea. We waited
le
for
temps
Drew not to know the
que
cameras
Drew
were turning,
ait
so she could be herself
l'idée
without
qu'elle
knowing
ne
we were
soit pas
actually
consciente des caméras tournées sur
exposing
elle,
film.
et c'est comme ça qu'on
The
a
same thing with Joey,
commencé à faire
working with
sortir
the
quelque
trainers,
chose de cela.
the
Pareil pour
whisperers,
Joey,
the
il y
horses
avait
themselves. It was amazing if we waited long enough, the horses would bring something
un certain
to
temps,
the scene
si on
that was
attendait,
not
eh bien,
scripted.
les chevaux
Here's an
apportaient quelque
example.
chose de film qui ne faisait pas partie
When
du scénario. Un
Peter
exemple,
Mullen, who plays
lorsque
the
Peter
father,
Mullen, qui joue le père,
buys the wrong horse because he's
n'achète pas le cheval qu'il fallait parce qu'il veut simplement, il veut faire la nique à son propriétaire qui jouait
He
par
brings the
David
wrong
Thewlis.
horse, Joey, back to the
Il vient
farm, and the mother just goes
avec
crazy
le cheval,
because
et
he
la
was
mère est
supposed to buy a
furieuse
plow
parce
horse,
qu'il est censé acheter
and not for that
un
much
cheval
money.
de labour pour
And
pas
he comes
grand-chose.
back
Il
having
revient
spent all his
dépenser
money
tout son
on the
argent,
wrong horse.
tout son argent sur le
And
cheval qui
as
n'était pas
she is berating
celui
him and
qu'elle
asking
voulait.
how much
Et
did you
donc,
pay for it, the horse
elle est
has
furieuse,
decided to start rubbing his head all over Peter Mullen's body. He's rubbing his head on Peter's shoulder, on his back. And then when Peter says 30 guineas, the horse turns to Peter and just almost pushes his hat off his head, kisses him right in the face twice.
l'embrasse pratiquement.
Joey was not trained to do that. That's what Joey improvised in the movie. That is an improvisational horse, the most improvisational animal in the history of movies. That horse improvised so wonderfully. And we just stood behind the camera with our hands across our mouths. We wouldn't ruin the sound because we were laughing. To see Joey actually interacting almost consciously with the cast that were very consciously reciting their dialogue. And that happens throughout the whole experience of making Warhorse.
Mais alors, bon, c'est vrai que vous l'avez dit, le cheval, vous ne l'avez pas diriger, mais comment faites-vous pour diriger vos acteurs en général? Quel type de relation d'abord vous avez avec vos acteurs? Je pense que je demande des questions un peu techniques parce que je sais qu'il y a beaucoup de jeunes dans la salle qui peut-être un jour seront des metteurs en scène, comme c'est déjà arrivé à la Cinémathèque. Comment on dirige, vous dirigez, vous Spielberg, dirigez vos acteurs?
Well, the first thing I do, and you probably read this book that had many directors here say this, because myself said this to you is because it's absolutely true. The best thing you can do, before even thinking about how am I going to direct an actor, is to cast the right actor. If you don't cast the right actor, you've got to direct 10 times harder than you really should, and you're going to really regret making a mistake in the casting process, because then you're going to really have to go to work. And so I spend a lot of time casting, because if I don't get the right character, the right actor to play the right character, I just know that it's going to distract me from really making my movie. I'm babysitting the entire film, trying to get a performance. So I always give casting a lot of the credit. Once you cast your film well, the second thing young filmmakers should do is listen to the people they cast. Listen to what they have to offer. They're preparing. They're at home. They're running their lines in a mirror. They're running their lines with their friends. They're coming up with ideas. They're writing down. They're doing research. They're writing notes in their own logbooks. And they come to the set, and the last thing they really need is for the director to say, I don't want to hear what your ideas are because I've got this already storyboarded, I got this all planned. And you start there, and then you sit in the chair, and you open the window, and you say your line this way. Why cast a talented person if you're going to presume your talent's over there? So the second thing is listen to the actor, because they're going to make invaluable contributions to the story that you want to tell. And you'll learn a lot about your own story, because your movie will evolve and grow. A movie is a living, breathing, human organism. It never stops evolving. Even if you're only shooting for 25 days or 15 days, your movie will evolve every day and kind of show you what it needs to tell itself a better story. And so the thing I've always learned from a lot of the great directors, and also from just experience, is you gotta listen more than speak. It doesn't mean you're not a director because you're not telling somebody what to do. You're putting the camera down, you're deciding what lens to use, you're deciding where to move the camera, you're even deciding how to block the actors. But you gotta listen to the actors first.
War Horse était très souvent filmé en plan large. On a le sentiment que vous voulez donner aux spectateurs le sentiment du paysage, de l'espace, et aussi de la liberté que le cheval a, parce que le cheval, il a vraiment, il sort, il rue, il a du mal, il ne veut pas être éduqué, il ne veut pas être enfermé. Et c'est important pour vous de raconter ce film en plan large?
Well, yeah, because if you don't use wide lenses when you're shooting a horse, the horse is out of your frame in about half a second, maybe 12 frames, he's gone. You wonder what was that. You start playing tricks, you slow down the film, you step printed, it drives you crazy. So you've got to shoot wide lenses just to let the horse cross, 20 feet. A person can cross the same 20 feet in 2.5 times longer than it takes a horse just to walk. So of course it had to be wider shots for the horse. It was also important to show these figures in the landscape, to show what the land meant. And so the wide shots were also to represent the importance of the land in the lives and survival of this very poor family. So the wide lenses served many purposes. But when you go to an amazing place like Devon, and you see the tours, and you see just the clouds coming off the ocean may be 25 miles away, but the clouds come roaring across of it. And in the movie, at the end, when Joey is coming back with Albert, and you suddenly just see a black screen, then the shadow parts to reveal them. That really happened. We saw the clouds coming. We put the rider up on the hill, and I told the rider to start, praying that the cloud would open. And our prayers were answered, and the cloud opened, revealing him just at the right time. So we used the weather, we used the landscape. When it rained, we shot in the rain. When it stopped raining, we went back to a scene that was supposed to take place either the day before or the day after. When more rain moved in, we went back to the plowing sequence. So every single shot, when they're plowing the field, it's actually raining. We enhanced the rain by having sprinklers right around the set, only so you could see the rain with bigger drops, but it was actually raining every time it looked like it was raining.
Le long de votre film, quand on regarde les crédits, comme vous dites, on voit les mêmes personnes, le même collaborateur, que ce soit la productrice, que ce soit le chef opérateur, Kaminski, que ce soit le musicien. C'est important pour vous de travailler avec les mêmes personnes?
It is because the team of people I've been working with, Johnny Williams and I are celebrating our 40th year this year, making movies together. We started in 1972 with my first film, Sugar Run Express, which John scored. Kathy Kennedy has been in my life. She started out as my secretary, and then 3 years later, I made her my producer on E.T. And 4 years later, I think it was. And once you find people that you can collaborate with and who make your life a lot easier, because making a film is, if you're making a film among strangers, it's twice as hard. So I keep the same editor. Michael Kahn cut every movie I've directed since Close Encounters, including Close Encounters. Janusz Kaminski has photographed every film since Schindler's List in 1993. And I just find this is really important, especially since these people are so much like chameleons. They can change. They don't bring a style, an indelible style that is so repetitive it becomes boring after a couple of pictures. John Williams can change his music and write in any style that the film requires. Janusz Kaminski can bend light in any way that the film requires. So they don't bring... One of my favorite composers is a composer named Bernard Herrmann. He does all the Hitchcock films and many of the Hitchcock pictures. You all know him. But his style was prevalent. His style was unmistakable. When you heard it, except maybe for The Ghost of Mrs. Muir and Taxi Driver, everything else he scored sounds like Bernard Herrmann. The great composer Dmitri Tiomkin sounds like Dmitri Tiomkin. And Johnny Williams doesn't do that, he changes. So my collaborators are chameleons in that way.
Est-ce que vous intervenez, et comment, quand il fait de la musique? Ou, par exemple, le chef opérateur, quand il éclaire, ou avant, est-ce que vous intervenez aussi? Et comment vous mettez d'accord sur tel ou tel style photographique, ou sur tel ou tel style de musique?
Yeah, of course, I may go to Janusz and say, Janusz, I want them to walk into the room and walk into silhouettes. I want to play the entire picture in silhouette until they go to the window, open the window up, and I'll sometimes say, don't use any fill light. I don't want to see the right side of the face. Sometimes I'll sort of, kind of insert myself that way if it makes the story point. I'm trying to use light to tell the story. But for the most part, I'll set the camera and I'll pick the lens. Sometimes Janusz and I fight about lens choices, but they're healthy, creative fights. But I pretty much, will move the camera where I need it to move and pick the lens. I always pick the composition. I always set the shot, keep my eye in the eyepiece, set the compositions, and show the compositions to the operator so he understands what I'm trying to get. But I don't light anything. And Janusz is a miracle work of light. I've never met anybody like him. Probably nobody since Ferraro has existed like Janusz, who really understands light and can change his style just through the way he manipulates it.
Parmi vos collaborateurs aussi, il y a Michael Kahn, votre monteur, avec qui vous montez tous vos films. Et c'est la première fois, je crois, que vous montez en Avid avec Warhorse. Et qu'est-ce qui fait que vous êtes passé sur Avid? Et est-ce que vous avez envie de rester, de continuer à travailler le montage de vos films sur Avid, ou de revenir au vieux système avec les tables de montage film?
Well, I have to admit that the last movie I cut on film was the fourth Indiana Jones film. That was the last time I actually cut on film. Then Tintin came along, which has no film step. There is no film. It's all digital animation. And then when I was making Tintin and improving animation. At the same time, I was making Warhorse, and we couldn't have two technologies under the same roof. We couldn't have the analog system for Warhorse with the Canon and Moviola, where I'm used to working, next to the digital Avid system. We just didn't have the room for it, so I made the decision with my editor to cut Warhorse on the Avid. Then, of course, I said, but the minute we make Lincoln, I'm going right back to film editor. I'm going to go right back to the Cam, right back to the Moviola. There's a lot of reasons I prefer that over the Avid. And my editor is about 76 years old right now. And my editor said, it'd be a lot easier for me to cut this thing on the Avid. And I said, are you saying you're too old to cut on film? He said, no, I can cut on film until I perish. But wouldn't it be nice just to sit back with that mouse in your hand? Wouldn't that be nice? And just if you want to see a take, you can compare the performances instantly. You put 7 takes up and we can run them all simultaneously. never been able to do on film. And by gosh, he talked me into it. So Lincoln, it was done also, is currently being edited right now on the Avid. I probably will always be shooting on film, and the films will be released on film, but I think that Indy was my last movie cutting on film.
On sort de Warhol, si vous voulez, on peut pas le poser.
Oui.
Qu'est-ce qui fait que parce que vous réalisez des films, vous produisez des films d'autres cinéastes, vous produisez des séries de télévision, vous êtes très très impliqué. Qu'est-ce qui fait qu'à un moment donné, vous dites ce sujet, c'est moi, c'est pour moi. Qu'est-ce qui fait la différence entre un sujet que vous avez vraiment envie de réaliser vous-même parmi toutes vos activités?
Right. Well, sometimes I really always like to say the projects find me. I don't really find the projects. I don't go on a search mission to find something to direct. I go to bookstores and read all the flaps to see if the narrative interests me on the book, because most of the books have been sold in the movies months before they ever hit the bookstore. You can't find a book that somebody doesn't own for either a TV movie or a television series or a picture. And I just prefer to, I just prefer to let it happen. And it really happens that way. Everything I've directed has just happened. And it's not because I went out looking for it. Maybe it was the genre I was interested in. I've always wanted to make a movie when I was a kid about UFOs. I believed in the UFO phenomenon. I thought UFOs were the most compelling piece of kind of mythological, contemporary cultural science, and I thought it was really interesting. And Close Encounters came along. I wrote the script. I couldn't get anybody to make it until Jaws was a hit, and everybody wanted to make it. Before Jaws was a hit, nobody wanted to even know about UFOs. And that's something that I really pursued, and that's where I had an idea, and the idea developed into a motion picture. A lot of things that come to me, like War Horse, for instance. Kathy Kennedy, my producing partner, had seen the play and said, "This is in your wheelhouse. I think if you read the book and saw the play, you would respond to this as a director." She knows me better than I know myself. And I read the book, and I saw the movie, I saw the play, and I instantly knew she was right. It was something I had to make instantly. So movies that I direct are movies that grab me and don't let me go. It's a chokehold, and the pressure is only off when I finish the film. And movies I wind up producing don't move me in the same way as movies that I wind up directing.
Je vais prolonger un tout petit peu cette question. Vous devez recevoir des dizaines, des centaines de scénarios chaque année, et aussi des centaines de livres. Tout doit converger vers vous, là, les plus beaux sujets. Alors, est-ce que vous avez un petit groupe de gens qui lisent pour vous, qui vous disent telle chose, il faut le lire, ou telle chose, il ne faut pas lire? Comment faites-vous? Parce que, humainement, vous ne pouvez pas lire tous les scénarios qu'on vous envoie.
No, I don't, because I can't, but I have a company called DreamWorks, and we've had the company since 1994, and I have a great story department, and sometimes I'll be developing a script to produce, not to personally produce, but for my company to produce, and I'll fall in love with it. It happened with a script we were developing called Catch Me If You Can, about this character, Frank Abagnale Jr., who was pretended to be an airline pilot, a lawyer, and a doctor, and it's all true, and we were developing it for Lasse Hallström to direct. And then all of a sudden Harvey Weinstein didn't want him working for DreamWorks, so Harvey said, "You've got to do a picture at Miramax, you owe us one more movie," and he preempted Lasse from doing the picture with us, and I had no intention of stepping in, but I was falling in love with this project. And it was almost like you fall in love with a woman, and she suddenly divorces her husband, and she's available. And then you marry her. And it's kind of why I married Catch Me If You Can. So there are some anecdotes like that have happened to me. But for the most part, I stumble over, I trip over movies I wind up directing. I'm not available to, I'm not alert to them, they're not on my radar. The things that I've had the most fun directing are films that a year or two previous to my committing to direct it were not even on my radar.
Il y a des années où vous faites deux films, alors ça, on se dit, par exemple là en 2011 vous avez fait Tintin et War Horse, mais moi ce qui m'a frappé c'est en 2005 vous faites La Guerre des Mondes et Munich, ou bien en 93 vous faites Jurassic Park et vous n'avez pas fini le film que vous entamez déjà la liste de Schindler. Il y a des moments où vous sentez qu'il y a une urgence absolue à faire un film, il y a quelque chose qui s'impose à vous, qui fait que vous faites deux films dans l'année, ce qui est en général assez lourd. Comment faites-vous?
Everybody thinks it's quite a big job and it's extraordinary that I would be making, I think, in 1997. 96 and 97, I directed 3 movies in 12 months. I directed The Lost World, sequel to Jurassic Park. I directed Amistad, and I directed Saving Private Ryan. and finished shooting all 3 movies inside one 12-month period. Everybody said, "Oh, mon Dieu, how can you possibly do that?" And I just say, read up on your history of Hollywood. John Ford directed 4 movies in a year. Howard Hawks was doing 4 movies a year. Raoul Walsh was doing 3-4 pictures a year. That was what the business used to be like. Directors went from soundstage to soundstage, from picture to picture. Victor Fleming did more pictures than any director, I think, in 1 year, at one point in his career. And I've always, it's not that I admired him so much, I wanted to imitate that, it's just that it can't be done, because if you're a storyteller, how can you possibly take a break from telling a story? When I don't have a story to tell, I'm a terror to live with. Ask my wife and my children what it's like to have me without a movie in my immediate future to direct. I mope, I walk around the house in a terrible state. My kids are trying to get me to help them with their homework, and I said, if I only had a movie, I could do a better job helping you with your homework. I'm miserable when I don't have something that I can immediately jump into. And so my family is the first ones that will call my company and say, is there anything in the files we can direct? Please help us. He's miserable right now. And so that's why sometimes I wound up directing like this year with War Horse and Tintin, which started many years ago, of course. And it took 3 years to animate, but it just happened to come out at the same time that War Horse was made, and Lincoln, which I just finished shooting on the 21st of December.
Et vous avez cité des cinéastes américains, ils n'avaient pas tous le Final Cut. Quand dans votre vie vous vous êtes dit, ma stratégie c'est d'obtenir le Final Cut, il faut que j'obtienne le Final Cut de la part des studios. Tous les cinéastes ne l'avaient pas, même John Ford, le montage était fait par d'autres. Vous, c'est quelque chose, vous vous êtes dit, vous étiez très jeune, vous vous êtes dit, il faut que j'obtienne ça, le Final Cut.
I think John Ford did have Final Cut, but not contractually. I also think what happened was John Ford never did coverage. He just cut the slates off and he put his films together. He cut his films in his head so the studios couldn't mess with them. He was very smart. But I got Final Cut early in my career only because of the size of the success that Jaws became. And I didn't even ask for Final Cut. It was presumed I was going to ask for it. So when I made a deal to do Close Encounters of the Third Kind with Columbia, we never had to ask for Final Cut. They put it in the contract, assuming we were going to ask what they preempted me from asking for it. And they just kind of gave it to me, and I've had Final Cut ever since. I keep waiting for them to take it away. Here's the important thing about Final Cut, and here's the danger of Final Cut. It essentially means that nobody can come in, a suit cannot come in to the cutting room and take your movie away from you and ruin it in about 3 days. That can't happen. The danger of having a Final Cut is sometimes you stop listening to other people who might have good advice for you. And once again, this is a highly collaborative medium, and everybody's ideas are important and relevant. They don't all work for me, and I only use ideas that I think will work to tell the story better. But I'm open to listening, and I've always done that. And so even though I have Final Cut, I've always gone to friends of mine and said, look at this, look at the film, look at the rough cut of this picture. What do you think? Where does it drag? Where could it use some editing? What didn't I shoot that maybe I should go back and shoot? And I've had that with a lot of my colleagues for many, many years.
Si vous voulez bien, je voudrais venir aux origines. L'idée générale en France, c'est que votre premier film, c'est le duel. Mais ça n'est pas exact. Je pense que c'est des films de télévision. Et avant, vous aviez fait 2 autres films de télévision. Un avec Joan Crawford, 40 actrices. Un autre, c'était des séries. Et un autre, un Colombo aussi, je crois, si je ne me trompe pas. Mais moi, je reste quand même au duel. Et comme je disais tout à l'heure, il y a peut-être des jeunes cinéastes, futurs cinéastes dans la salle, ou même des cinéastes. Comment choisit-on un film aussi extraordinaire, un sujet aussi extraordinaire? Je pense que c'était vraiment tellement un maître de maître que de choisir un sujet d'une grande simplicité, avec une tension extraordinaire, et aussi avec une métaphore aussi sur nos angoisses. Sur nos angoisses et comment les survivre, comment les combattre. Comment c'est venu cette idée?
Well, I think it's interesting because now you'll hear how I trip over projects sometimes and how important luck and timing are. But I was sitting around doing a television show at Universal Studios, and my secretary came into the office, and she said, have you read the latest issue of Playboy? And I say, have you? And she said, yeah, I always read Playboy. There's a great story in Playboy by Richard Matheson called The Duel. And she gave it to me, and I read this amazing story in Playboy of a truck and a man and a car, and just the movie you saw. And I got immediately, I thought, oh my God, I've got to make this movie. How do I do this? And then I found out that somebody had already previously purchased the film rights, and they were about to make it as a TV movie at Universal. And I went to the producer's office, introduced myself. The only thing I really had to show that I was proud of was the pilot for Columbo. And I only had a rough cut, so George Eckstein, the producer, came to a small screening room at Universal. He sat down, I sat next to him, and I showed him my hour and 10-minute cut of the first episode ever of Columbo. And he liked it, and he went to bat for me, and he went to ABC to see if ABC would hire me. And of course, ABC said, no, he's too young. I had to hear this for years, believe me. He's too young. We need a veteran to do this. He's just a kid. And George, to his credit, fought for me and just wore them down, kept rejecting other directors that they were suggesting, ABC Network, until finally they relented and said, okay, but you're responsible, George. If he screws up, you're responsible. And so that was something between this very wonderful producer who just recently passed away, bless his heart, and my secretary at the time. That's how I stumbled over Duel.
Vous avez une relation, grâce à ça, et puis d'autres, les autres films que j'ai, enfin les autres séries que j'ai mentionnées, vous avez une relation assez étroite avec la télévision finalement, puisque vous produisez aussi des séries. C'est important pour vous, la télévision? Parce que je sais, peut-être ici en France, beaucoup de metteurs en scène, entre nous considérons un tout petit peu comme un art, je dirais, secondaire, sinon tertiaire.
In America, television is a primary art form. Some of the best writing is being done for cable in America. Some of the best writing of HBO series, Showtime series, FX, AMC, all of the small cable stations that have grown and have started to do homemade movies just for their stations because they're looking for content, of course. Everybody's searching for content. But they're attracting new writers, playwrights from Broadway, from theater, from over here. And they're writing tremendous, so like Boardwalk Empire is brilliantly written. The Sopranos was brilliantly written. Some of the best writing of comedy. Modern Family is a television series I watch every week. American television. It's as funny or funnier than some of the best comedies that are out there today. So I think television is having a very deep and profound renaissance in the US.
Il y a quelque chose dans vos films qui est très important, c'est l'enfance. Vous traitez l'enfance, à la fois les enfants, mais aussi l'enfance. C'est-à-dire, qu'est-ce que c'est pour vous l'enfance? Pourquoi? On a l'impression que vous puisez toute votre imagination, votre énergie dans l'enfance. Quel est le secret chez vous là, lié à l'enfance? On a le sentiment que je suis très fort. Est-ce que vous avez vu L'Enfant sauvage de Truffaut quand vous étiez au début de parce que j'ai toujours le sentiment quand je vois vos films que vous êtes un peu comme chez Truffaut, l'enfant veut rentrer dans le monde et le monde souvent refuse les enfants. Et on a le sentiment que vous faites des films pour imposer l'enfance comme la chose la plus belle au monde. Est-ce que c'est vrai?
There's a lot of truth in that, which is also the reason I cast François Truffaut to be in Close Encounters. You know, I'd seen him, I didn't know he was an actor also, and I saw Wild Child, I saw him in that role. And I approached him, and he said he would. I came here to Paris to cast, and I met 20, 25 actors, but I had written it for Truffaut, not ever imagining he'd say yes. And when Truffaut and I worked together for many, many months, and we got to know each other very well, you know, he also felt that I was a wild child. He said we're both wild children. And Truffaut also said he had just finished, he was editing in Mobile, Alabama, while we were shooting a movie called Small Change. Matter of fact, he asked me, I helped him supply the American title for, what was it called, Prochaine? L'Agent de Poche. He kept saying, what does this mean? I mean, I'm going to call my movie L'Agent de Poche. How do you say it in English? I said Small Change. And once he described what it was, that became the American title for the film. And he said to me, he said, you must work with kids. You're a kid. You must work with children. I love the experience myself. I recommend it to you. You must go out and make a movie with kids. And I never forgot that advice. It's just who I am. I mean, it's just who I am. You know, you can't intellectually purge yourself from whoever you are. Whatever that is going to come out in the wash. And it's going to come out in the film wash. And what you are is going to be relevant, you know, if not to yourself, to the movies you make, because you can't, I don't think anybody can intellectually change themselves and be someone they're not. And if they are, you'll see through it. You'll see that it's artificial. So if I still am making movies that have that sense of childhood, it's because perhaps that's just, I haven't ever, drifted too far away from that source.
C'est ça le secret dont vous parliez, Costa. Mais Truffaut, Steven, Truffaut a été sauvé par le cinéma. Et j'ai l'impression que vous aussi, le cinéma... Enfin, est-ce que le cinéma vous a sauvé dans la vie? Est-ce que le cinéma, c'est plus important que la vie pour vous? Ou est-ce que c'est la vie?
Well, I thought film was more important than life itself for many years, and then in 1985, my first child was born, and I realized that film instantly took a back seat to real life. And then I was able to actually be more truthful in making movies, because I had a reflection of a real human being in my life that was growing and evolving, and my movies, I suddenly said I've got a real reason now to even do more work. But yeah, for a long time in my life, movies were everything. There was nothing else beyond film. And like I said, if I don't have a story to tell, I go crazy.
Nous sommes là en plein dans le... Alors je poserai une question un tout petit peu provocatrice, parce que nous sommes en plein dans les relations de cinéma américain et cinéma français. J'ai entendu la chose suivante par un producteur très célèbre en Amérique, qui a fait des gros succès, qui m'a dit, vous voyez, vous en France, quand vous faites un film, vous dites au départ, je vais faire une œuvre importante. Tandis que nous faisons un produit qui peut devenir une œuvre importante par la suite. C'est-à-dire le contraire de vous, Français, m'a-t-il dit. Y a-t-il une part de vérité dans cela?
It seems to be a crime against all cinema to call a movie a product. That's a crime against cinema. Soap and cereal are products.
C'est un mot qu'on entend souvent à Los Angeles. Product. We have product here, this year, or we don't have product, enough product.
Yeah, they also say, let's take a lunch. How do you take a lunch? Do you go into a restaurant where somebody is eating and take the plate away from the person? Is that what take a lunch means? There's these crazy sayings in Hollywood. I'm sorry that they've come over to France, as such a pure country of real cinema lovers, and suddenly we're hearing about product and take a lunch now for me. I'm sorry about that. I apologize for my colleagues who sometimes, but not all of them. Directors don't ever say that. I don't ever hear my director colleagues ever talk that way. You may be referring to a producer, perhaps, or a studio head, a suit, which I technically am myself.
I don't know the usual one.
Avec l'expérience, est-ce que vous pensez que la tonalité de vos films a changé? Est-ce que vous pensez que, ou depuis le 11 septembre 2001, est-ce que vous pensez que votre œuvre est différente? Est-ce qu'elle est plus grave, ou est-ce qu'elle est moins portée à l'émerveillement, par exemple? Ce qui est un peu mon avis. Est-ce que c'est le vôtre?
Well, it did. I think the two things that really started to consciously change the way I looked at life. And of course, the way I look at life is, like I said before, to come out in the wash of the movies that I make after I've had some kind of a little bit of a shift in my point of view. But 9/11 changed a lot for me, as it changed a lot for everybody in the world. And my films did grow darker after 9/11. Minority Report, a very dark look at the future, and certainly War of the Worlds, which was a direct reference to 9/11. It was, a real post-9/11 story. Not intended that way, but that's the way it turned out. So yeah, I think that the world has a great impact on how it colors my movies, and I think that's a good sign, because it just means I'm changing by being aware of what's happening. We can all love film and get lost in film, and we can get lost in the kind of alternative life that film provides for us, because you're watching something, I watch something when I see a film that has gone through an entire generation. It's gone through an entire human life between the writer and the director, and everybody else makes a contribution. But really, first the writer and then the filmmaker, the director. And you're seeing how they see the world, the way they see the world. And you can either agree or disagree with the way they see things. But it is not something, it is a second generation revelation. It is not an original catharsis that we all have every day in our life when something happens to us, when we see something happening to our friends, both tragically and even joyfully. And all these things are very important to remember, that when we see a movie, it is not real life, it's the way a real person sees life. And so that's why, by being aware, which I've been more now than ever before, of the news, of the political situation, mostly all around the world, because now we live in a global universe. We no longer are living just for ourselves and our own national interest. We can't ever live just for our own national interest. We have to understand that we're all interconnected now. And because that exists, and I'm much more alert because I have children who I want to keep safe and I want to protect. I was much more fearful after my kids were born. I have 7 kids, much more fearful after my kids started coming into the world than I ever was before I had children. And all those things give you a different aspect, a different way of seeing life.
Serge a prononcé des mots un émerveillement. Moi, je voudrais vous dire, c'est pas une question, je voudrais vous dire simplement que vous êtes encore le metteur en scène qui prouve que l'émerveillement est possible avec le cinéma.
I need to let that exist with your response to your insight, because I can't even follow that beautiful observation with a comment. I just can't. It'll spoil it.
On a encore 120 questions à vous poser, mais moi je voudrais vous dire que je suis très, très intimidé de vous rencontrer, oui, je suis comme toute la salle et toutes les 3 salles de la Cinémathèque, parce que c'est vrai que vous êtes... on a le sentiment que vous réussissez votre vie, et en réussissant votre vie, vous posez des questions au monde, et vous les posez de la façon la plus honnête possible. Et ça, je trouve ça... on voit bien à vous écouter qu'il y a une grande humilité dans ce que vous dites. Il y a des choses dont vous êtes certain, des choses sur lesquelles vous vous posez des questions. Et avec la réussite qui est la vôtre, vous pourriez être au-dessus de tout ça, arrogant et plein de certitudes. Et moi, je trouve incroyable, j'ai revu beaucoup de vos films pour préparer cette masterclass, et je suis frappé par cette capacité, cette lucidité que vous avez sur le monde. Cette lucidité, cette intelligence et cette lucidité que vous avez sur le monde. C'est-à-dire vous êtes tout le temps... Ce n'est pas une question, c'est un commentaire, pardon. Et vous êtes tout le temps en face des choses et vous les regardez. Vous n'avez pas peur de regarder les choses et le monde tel qu'il est.
Well, listen, thank goodness for that. And all of us, I think, to many degrees, some degrees, need to look at the world, head on and not lie to ourselves about what's really happening. But I also believe in something else, and that is there's a danger in having too much confidence. You just mentioned confidence. And let me tell you just a little bit about confidence. I'm confident when I make a sequel to a movie that's already been a great success, and my sequels haven't been very good. And I think to my own films. And I think the reason for that is because I work better in a state of confusion and a little bit of chaos, and a little bit of uncertainty, because it makes me work harder to find the idea, it makes me search harder and look more minutely and more closely at the details of a moment, a scene, a script, a problem that we're having with the script. If I'm too confident, what do you do when you're very confident? You say, let it stand the way it is, let it exist the way it is. I'm very confident in this, why change it? Why improve it into a failure? And so, a lack of confidence from day to day for me is really the juice that keeps me going. And if I get to the end of the day and I'm confident in the work that day, that's okay. You don't want to come to work with total confidence. And I think the same thing can be said with a great tennis player. You don't want to come, to the court with such great confidence that you just don't understand why you keep missing the shots. And so I think it's very, very important that when you make movies and when you act in movies and when you're involved in some way in creating something that is representing who you are in this world, that you don't do it from a position of smugness and confidence. That you do it always wondering, is this good enough? And is this good enough for the people I'm going to show it to? And most importantly, is this really my best work? Is it good enough for me? And it's important to always be a little behind the curve. Don't be ahead of yourself.
Je sais, pour prolonger ce que disait Serge, votre vie n'est pas seulement le cinéma. C'est-à-dire que vous avez un regard sur le monde. Je sais que vous avez créé la Shoah Foundation, qui est un travail extraordinaire, qui consiste... enfin, je vous laisse dire 2 mots sur ça, parce que c'est très intéressant.
Well, but that was the thing about real life. We're talking about film in real life. You know, there have been several films I've made where I try to get as close to real life as possible. One of those films, aside from Saving Private Ryan, was Schindler's List, where I tried very much to honorably and accurately acquit the testimonies of the survivors who were on Schindler's List and who were survivors of the Holocaust. And I thought I had done my best work when I finished Schindler's List. Long before anybody saw it, I really felt that I had done my best work. And then I realized that my best work was right around the corner, which was really the Shoah Foundation, which is where, through the strength and power of let's put it this way, through the result of Schindler's List, and that it opened up a lot of hearts and minds, and a lot of people decided to learn more about the Shoah, the Holocaust, you know, after the film had been released. It allowed me to come up with this idea that what if we took video cameras when all over the world where all the survivors fled after World War II and got them to talk about their experiences? Could that be a benefit in schools, in social science programs, in the middle schools and in the high schools, all over the world, not just in America? And that became the greatest result, I think, of Schindler's List. We were able to get 52,000 actual visual history testimonies from Holocaust survivors. Not just those on Schindler's List, of course, that was just several thousand, 1,200, but people who would survive the Holocaust. Half of them wouldn't talk to us, and never wanted to think about it or speak about it again. And a lot of the people, you'll find this interesting, a lot of the survivors who spoke to us had never, ever told their own children or grandchildren what had happened to them in Poland, in Germany. And they still wouldn't talk about it, but they gave the tape, the copy of the tape that we gave them. They gave the tape to the kids. And they allowed that tape to represent the entire story of that human tragedy.
On va arrêter.